How does an empire begin its fall? We often picture it as this huge, explosive event. But what if it wasn't a bang? What if it all started with something much smaller, like a single, poorly chosen verb? We're going to see how one word, in one treaty, didn't just spark a war. It completely shattered the myth of European invincibility. It inspired a global movement, and it left a legacy so powerful, people are still fighting over what it means today.
Okay, so picture this. It's the 1st of March, 1896. You're in the hills around Adwa in northern Ethiopia, and a massive army has gathered. Tens of thousands of soldiers, a whole sea of riflemen and cavalry, all of them united, waiting. And they're about to face a modern European army, an army that truly believes it cannot be beaten.
And you have to understand, this was the thinking all across Europe at the time. This was the peak of the so-called Scramble for Africa. And the idea that an African nation could actually fight off a European colonial power, it was almost unthinkable. So Italy, desperate to build its own empire, saw Ethiopia as the next logical prize. They were confident, they were well-equipped, and they were about to get the shock of their lives.
But to really get how we ended up on this battlefield, we've got to rewind the clock about 7 years. Because the real start of this conflict wasn't some border dispute, and it wasn't a fight for resources. No, it was a fight over the meaning of a single word in a document, the 1889 Treaty of Wuchale. And this right here, this is where the deception is just laid bare for all to see. The treaty was written in 2 languages, Italian and Amharic. But Article 17 said 2 completely different things. The Italian version used the phrase consente di servirsi, which they said was mandatory. It meant Ethiopia had to use Italy for all its foreign relations, which basically turns it into a protectorate. But the Amharic version used the word Wuchale, which means Ethiopia could use Italy's help. It was an option, not an order.
And look, this was not some simple, innocent mistake. Not at all. Italy ran with its version, announcing to the other European powers that Ethiopia was now under its control. But Emperor Menelik II, well, he had signed a document that he believed guaranteed his nation's independence. When he found out what they'd done, he knew he'd been tricked. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was, as one historian calls it, an act of deliberate diplomatic fraud.
This quote just tells you everything you need to know about the resolve of the Ethiopian leadership. While Emperor Menelik was a shrewd diplomat, his wife, Empress Taytu Betul, was an absolute force of nature. When she found out about the treaty's wording, she was furious and argued fiercely against any compromise. Her challenge, right to the Italian negotiator's face, pretty much said it all. This was going to be settled on the battlefield.
So when Menelik officially rejected the treaty, Italy decided it would enforce its version by military might. And that's how 2 armies ended up marching toward a confrontation in the rugged highlands of Adwa.
Just look at these numbers for a second. They tell so much of the story. Ethiopia had mobilized this colossal force that just dwarfed the Italian army. But it wasn't just about numbers. They had the ultimate home field advantage. They knew the terrain inside and out. The Italians? They were basically stumbling around in a landscape they didn't understand, using maps that were completely wrong.
And you might be thinking, sure, they had numbers, but what about the technology? Well, don't make the mistake of thinking this was a spears versus guns fight. While Italy had its modern rifles, Menelik had spent years playing the diplomatic game, buying up tens of thousands of modern firearms from countries like France and Russia, who were actually pretty happy to see Italy's ambitions checked. So the Ethiopian army wasn't just big, it was well armed.
When the battle finally happened, it was an absolute catastrophe for the Italians. They were outnumbered, they were outmaneuvered, and their columns got separated and destroyed one by one. Certain Ethiopian units, like the legendary Oromo cavalry, were just devastatingly effective. Their appearance on the battlefield alone was enough to spread panic and completely shatter the Italian lines.
The Ethiopian victory was total. It was decisive. But the story was far from over. Because the shockwaves from this one battle traveled thousands of miles, all the way back to Rome, and hit the country like a political earthquake.
Think about this for a second. Around 5,000 Italian soldiers were killed in a single day of fighting. For a European army in the colonial era, taking that many casualties against an African force was almost unheard of.
And on top of the dead, another 3,000 were taken prisoner. The scale of the defeat was just staggering. The news that got back to Italy wasn't just of a military loss, it was a deep national humiliation.
And back home, the reaction was immediate, and it was violent. Riots just erupted in the big cities. Crowds were in the streets demanding an end to this whole colonial adventure.
The government of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, the man who had pushed so hard for this war, it just collapsed in total disgrace. The defeat at Adwa became this deep, dark national trauma.
And this trauma, it didn't just go away. It lingered. It festered for decades. So much so that 40 years later, when another Italian leader, Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia with planes and poison gas, his rallying cry was, "Adwa has been avenged." The memory of that one single defeat was a direct spark for the rise of Italian fascism and a war of revenge.
So for Italy, Adwa was this profound national trauma. But for the rest of the world, and especially for people of African descent, it was like a clap of thunder. It was pure inspiration. And its true legacy would stretch way, way beyond Ethiopia.
And this is why Adwa is so incredibly important. At the absolute height of European colonialism, when the idea of white invincibility was just taken for granted, Ethiopia proved that an African nation could, through unity and strategy, decisively beat a modern European power. It punched a hole right through the racist ideas that the entire colonial project was built on.
Adwa became this incredibly powerful symbol for Black pride and for resistance all over the globe. The leaders of the growing Pan-Africanist movement, from Marcus Garvey in Jamaica to W.E.B. Du Bois in the US, and even future independence leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, they all pointed to Ethiopia's victory as hard proof that freedom from colonial rule wasn't just a dream, it was possible.
But, like with so much of history, the story isn't that simple. Because while Adwa is celebrated as this glorious moment of unity all around the world, its memory inside Ethiopia today, well, it's a lot more complicated. It has actually become a battleground.
And here is the central paradox of Adwa. For many Ethiopians, it's the nation's finest hour, a moment of perfect unity. But for others, especially for groups in the south like the Oromo, the victory is tangled up with the legacy of Emperor Menelik II himself. He wasn't just the hero of Adwa, he was also an empire builder who used brutal force to conquer and control them. So for them, the victory that saved Ethiopia from foreign rule also cemented a kind of internal domination.
To really get this, we have to think about this idea of collective memory. It's not just about historical facts and dates, right? It's about the stories a nation chooses to tell about itself. Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? And these stories, they are always selective and they are always contested.
So when people in Ethiopia argue about Adwa today, they're not really arguing about what happened back in 1896. They're fighting over the present and they're fighting for the future. It's a struggle over whose story gets told, whose sacrifices get remembered, and really, what it even means to be Ethiopian in the 21st century. And that leaves us with this incredible question, doesn't it? How can the exact same memory, the same victory, inspire freedom for millions across the world, and at the same time become a source of such deep division right where it happened? It just proves that history is never really in the past. It's a living, breathing thing, and the echo of that single disputed word is still shaping our world today.